Welcome to the Tuesday edition of Juan's World, and I won't be doing any cooking today, but I'm giving you a little foretaste because Sunday, this coming Sunday, is Stir Up Sunday, Sunday before Advent, when it's traditional to make your Christmas puddings, and stir up comes from the collect of the day. Don't remember it because I'm not Anglican, but it's something like stir up your souls. But we stir up the Christmas puddings on the Sunday before Advent so that they're ready for Christmas. And I'm getting a little jump on it. This is my mincemeat, or at least some of my mincemeat. I like to prepare it also about 6 weeks before Christmas. In the United States, I used to prepare it a year ahead. And I do have my Christmas pudding from last year soaking in brandy. It's a year old. I'll make a new one to put down for next year, next Sunday. And so next Tuesday I will talk about Christmas cooking. For now, I want to get back to my ideas about knowing and believing. And today I'm going to talk about the rather elusive concept of proof and evidence. So let's start down that path. All right, so let's tackle this idea of proof. There's a lot of different kinds of truth, as I proposed last time. There is truth by definition, mathematical, logical truth, empirical truth, and proof is different for those different kinds of truths. So that, for example, if you present me with somebody maybe on a television show who is called a bachelor, then you can prove that that person is a bachelor, or at least get close to it, by looking at the definition. Remember, I said last time that a bachelor is a man who is eligible to be married, who has never been married. Well, if you're going to prove he's a bachelor by that definition, then you're going to need to produce some documents. And this is a difficult one because you're going to have to prove a negative. You're going to have to prove he's never been married. Well, that's a little tough because you're going to have to not produce marriage certificates. You're going to have to show that that person was never issued a marriage certificate. Well, lots of luck with that. I had to prove that I was eligible to be a UK citizen by descent a long time ago, and that meant that I had to show that I was born to, at the time it was deeply sexist, I had to prove that I was the son of a citizen of the UK who was my father, not my mother. It's different now, I think. I had to prove that my father was born in the UK, and I had to prove that he was married to my mother in the year before I was born, and they were still married. So I had to produce a lot of documents. I had to produce his birth certificate, I had to produce their marriage certificate, and that was considered enough. I did not have to somehow prove that they were continuously married, that they had not been divorced and all of that kind of thing. But that was sufficient. So it's a kind of empirical proof that's not ironclad, but good enough. There's things like legal proof, and there are rules of evidence, and they are also not ironclad. Like, prove that this person committed this burglary, or maybe somebody saw that person enter the house and leave with stolen items, or maybe somebody who that person tried to sell the items to comes forward to testify. So you've got eyewitnesses. But it's also true that eyewitness testimony is not ironclad, particularly if time goes by. If you've ever seen the movie My Cousin Vinny, which is a movie I love, you can see that often people can be mistaken in their identification of people accused of crimes for all kinds of reasons. And that could equally be true of closed circuit television, because a person may look like the person who committed a crime but is not that person, and so on. All right, so empirical proof has all kinds of flaws in it. Mathematical proof is also very difficult. I used to ask my students, back when I was a professor of anthropology, to prove to me that 2 + 2 = 4. It's one of those things that we take for granted. I said, okay, prove it. And one of the standard proofs would be to hold up 2 fingers, right there, 2 fingers, say, okay, 2, 2, 4. And they would say, okay, that's the proof. Say, no, I didn't ask you to prove that 2 fingers plus 2 fingers equals 4 fingers. I asked you to prove that 2 plus 2 equals 4. And usually around that point, most of them would just give up, like, oh, he's off in outer space now. But the point I was trying to make was that 2 fingers, or 2 rocks, or 2 books, or 2 apples is not the same as 2, the number 2. And one of the things that you have to do to prove that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is to define 2, and not define it empirically. As when you hold up 2 fingers, that's empirical. That's saying that this is 2 things. I was asking the abstract mathematical question, how do you prove that 2 and 2 equals 4? So first of all, explain to me what 2 is, what the number 2 is. And this is something that perplexed Plato and Aristotle and all kinds of philosophers down to the 19th century, and even now. I mean, there are some people who claim that mathematical numbers are real, but their proof, if you like, is, well, they are. And there are others who say, well, we can't define them. We just accept what they are. And that would be called axiomatic mathematics. That is, we just sort of know by intuition what 2 is. What is plus? What is add? What is addition? Also, they're not very well defined terms. But here's the thing. If you accept that 2 plus 2 equals 4, things go well in the actual physical world. If you don't, if you refuse to accept that, or if you decide that 2 plus 2 equals 5, things go crazy. So mathematical proofs rest on certain axiomatic or intuitive thoughts, but they work. And that's equally true for scientific truth. That is, the physics of Newton will allow engineers to design rockets that can carry people to the moon and back. So that the proof, if you like, if we call it proof, is that their theories, their provisional facts, work. They get things done by using those theories. But they are provisional theories, and we know that Newton works perfectly well within our solar system on Earth, but it does not work terribly well when we think about distances, time and space in the universe. And that's where Einstein comes along. So Einstein modified Newton, but for all intents and purposes, Newton works okay, but it's provisional. Okay. So we can say Newton is his laws of physics are true enough to get things done. They're not perfect, but they're true enough. Now, I do want to be clear that I'm not equating scientific truth with religious belief. You know, a lot of people will say, you know, the difference between science and religion is that science is based on fact and religion is based on belief. And as I said last time, both science and religion are based on belief. They're based on certain axioms, things that we think are obvious, and they seem to work. Okay, that's fine. So scientific belief is based on certain kind of axioms. Religious beliefs are based on different kinds of axioms. And they're the kind of axioms that some people just don't accept. And that's, as far as I'm concerned, that's just fine. You don't have, if you don't accept, for example, the existence of God, that's fine. I don't have any problem with that. But we can use a kind of methodology that is similar to the scientific method to test the beliefs of religion. Now, Thomas Aquinas made a stab at proving the existence of God, and his proofs are not great. I won't go into all of them, but let's look at a couple of them. One of them was based on cause and effect. That is, that in scientific worldview, every cause has an effect. Or we can put it the other way around, every effect has a cause. And every cause is the effect of another cause. And so on, all the way back. You know, we can say that what is happening now was caused by things that happened in the past. And Aquinas argued, well, if we start off with the world as it is now, and we go back to causes that created how things are now, and we can then look at the causes that created those causes and the causes that created those causes, and blah 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 blah, like on the way, all the way back. Now you've got a choice. You can just say, well, we can go infinitely back into the past so that there never was a beginning of anything, which actually even modern science doesn't believe. But certainly Thomas Aquinas didn't accept it, and his audience didn't accept it either. So what he said was that the prime cause, the first cause of all, the thing that started everything, must be God. Like, God must exist because something must have set all of these chains of cause and effect in motion. Well, I mean, you can see the obvious fallacy there. There's no reason to accept that there was a primary cause just on the face of it. All right. That was one. He had several proofs that looked like that. Another one, which has always been fascinating, sometimes called the ontological argument, is kind of an argument by definition. That God is by definition the most perfect entity in the universe. And if God is perfect, then one aspect of his perfection is existence, because to exist is more perfect than not existing. Therefore, God exists. Now, I know that's an awfully tortured argument, and some people countered it by saying, well, you could use that same argument to argue that a perfect island exists, because a perfect island, to be perfect, would have to exist, and therefore the perfect island exists. I mean, you can see that these proofs are not really proofs at all. That the existence of God is really a fundamental tenet of belief. And there's also the question of how you define God. That if you define God in biblical terms, you end up wrapping yourself into all kinds of knots. Because even if you just look at Genesis, that God is the prime mover, as in Aquinas's philosophy, like the person that brought everything else into existence. So the first chapter of Genesis has God surveying dark, watery nothingness and says, "Let there be light," and light comes into existence, and he does all of that and eventually creates the world and animals and plants and people. But then in the second chapter he plants a garden and he likes to walk in the garden in the cool of the evening. So you've got this massively transcendent creator God in the first chapter, and then this like gardener in the second chapter. So how do you define God using those premises? It's really extraordinarily difficult, and of course has kept theologians awake at night for millennia defining God. And I'm not going to do it for you for a number of reasons. But there is one of the starting points is believing in not just God as something or other, but believing in a God that does specific things. And you can test that hypothesis that this God exists. In the same way that you can test the hypothesis or the hypotheses that Newton created by building a rocket ship and going to the moon. Well, how do you test the existence of God? Well, there's a lot of ways. One of them is to test the efficacy of prayer, because certainly within the Judeo-Christian tradition, you can pray to God, and the Christian tradition at least says that prayer will work if you pray in the right way. And this is in fact where anthropologists have a lot of trouble with religion in general, because that kind of belief is impossible to test, and this is why. You see, when you propose a hypothesis in natural science, you can test it using the methods of cause and effect. And if your experiment doesn't work, then you may have to go back to the drawing board, or you may decide that you didn't conduct the right experiment, but it's all fairly clearly defined. But prayer is a bit awkward, because what the Christian tradition argues, and I'm speaking now purely about the Christian tradition, is that prayer works if you have faith. And if you don't have faith, it doesn't work. Nor does it work if your motives are suspect, or if you're a bad person. There's all kinds of ways in which prayer will not work. That you can't just pray to become a millionaire if your intentions are suspect, they're selfish, let's say. Or let's say your motives aren't selfish. Let's say you pray that your parent will be cured of cancer. Well, there's a good one. We can test that. We can take a person who has cancer, and we can take a son or daughter who is a devout Christian who prays for that parent to be cured, and we can do a series of tests. In fact, we can take 10,000 parents and 10,000 children and look and see how many of them get cured of cancer. That's only by prayer, not by medical intervention. I'll get to that part in a little bit, but I'm just talking about the power of prayer. And certainly plenty of people have tried to do statistical analyses of the efficacy of prayer and have found that it doesn't work. Now, a devout Christian could argue that it didn't work in the majority of cases because those people didn't have enough faith, or they were bad people, or their motives were corrupt, or something like that. If there's always an out like that, then the scientific method is not going to work. And people can always say, well, all right, I prayed for sunny weather for the picnic, and it rained that day. And they'll say, well, God moves in mysterious ways. His motives are inscrutable. That when you've got an out like that all the time, there's no way to prove that prayer is or is not effective. So why do people pray? Now, one of the answers that anthropologists give, and it's a kind of cynical answer, because the vast majority of anthropologists are atheists, and they make the claim that people pray as a last resort. That is, that they try everything, and when all the reasonable answers to a problem have failed, then they resort to prayer. Well, I don't think that's really how Christians pray, but it is the it is a common argument that prayer is an alternative to science, and there is actually an old Christian joke about a man who is experiencing a flood that keeps rising, and he eventually climbs out onto his roof, and the waters keep rising, and he prays to God that he'll be saved. And at one point a boat comes along, and the man in the boat says, "Get in the boat, I'll take you to safety." And the man says, "No, God will save me." And so the boat goes away, and then a little later a helicopter hovers over and drops a line and says, "Climb up." And the man says, No, I've prayed to God, he'll save me." And so the helicopter goes away, and so forth. And eventually the flood waters rise above the roof, above the man's head, and he drowns. And he goes to heaven, and he says to God, "I prayed to you. What happened?" And God says, "Well, I sent you a boat, no, I sent you a helicopter. What more did you want?" And what this is in effect saying is that God works through the material world, so that he works through science, or he works through medical technology, or what have you, so that the person who prays that their cancer or a friend's cancer goes away, and it does, then they will say, "Well, it was because I prayed, not because of the chemotherapy or the radiation or the surgery or whatever, or a combination of those things." That's really, that's a very strange argument, because you don't need God in any of those circumstances. But religion is not just about prayer, and it's not just about some kind of miraculous intervention. It's also about community. It's also about people of faith coming together and supporting each other, so that when somebody in the family dies, there are people gathering all around to help and to support you. When my wife died, the church was overflowing with people who'd come to support me and my son, including the entire band that my son played in. They came to the church to play outside as people were entering for the funeral services, and it was enormously supportive. And again, you can say, well, you don't need religion for that, and of course you don't. You can have a secular funeral, you can have funeral parlors where people meet and they don't pray. Usually they do, but they don't have to. But there's something comforting about prayer in times of stress. And I would argue that, I wouldn't say that that's proof that prayer works. I would say it's an aspect of prayer that is very important to us. And when people come together, it's very important for the whole community. So, I'm not saying that religion works, faith works, or any such thing, in the same way that I'm saying that Newton's laws of motion work. But I am saying that belief systems within religious traditions have values, and they're based on belief. There's a different kind of belief from scientific belief, but it's still important. Or at least it's important to the people who believe, and important to me, important at all kinds of times. So that's a little deeper look at the nature of proof, and I hope a slightly deeper perspective on the nature of faith and the nature of evidence, because we know in scientific discovery or experimentation that sometimes the things that you expect to happen because of your theories don't happen, and you have to explain that. And you equally well have to explain that when it comes to religion. Like, if prayer doesn't work, you've got to explain it. If your beliefs don't work, you've got to explain them. Doesn't matter whether you're talking about religion or science. You still need to explain why you're doing what you're doing. All right, well, we're heading into the Christmas season, as I said at the beginning, starting with Stir Up Sunday next Sunday, and then Advent. And so I'm going to talk a lot more about Christmas and Christian traditions. And I will do some Christmas cooking. And in the meantime, please tell your friends. Please like and subscribe, and have a good week. And I will see you on Friday.